From a lineage that treated destiny like an equation, Darth Plagueis inherited the cold instruments of fate, probability, patience, and the austere geometry of the dark side. His master, Tenebrous, measured survival in probabilities, a Sith of numbers who believed risk could be neutralized by calculation. Plagueis absorbed those lessons, but he was not satisfied with arithmetic alone. He looked beneath the math to the lattice of existence itself. The midichlorians, the microscopic bridges between life and the Force. To him, destiny was not just predicted, it could be rewritten. Basically, Tenebrous taught him how to count outcomes, but Plagueis wanted to sculpt them. By stepping past mathematics into biology, he saw a chance to bind death, to preserve life as easily as one might preserve wealth. In that shift, betrayal became to him an outdated relic, a flaw in the system that his mastery would soon erase. The Jedi sought harmony. Plagueis sought dominion over breath, over cells, over the subtle choreography that keeps spirit married to flesh. His laboratories became temples, not of prayer but of manipulation. He watched embryos quicken, organs heal, and lives unnaturally prolonged under his command. Think of it this way, he wasn't chasing political dominance. He wanted the operating system of life itself. Where a senator could sway laws, Plagueis could sway existence. If he bent the root, the tree, the forest, and the galaxy had no choice but to follow. In this conviction, the old Sith axiom that apprentices must one day kill their masters appeared crude, primitive. Why wield daggers when eternity itself bent before him? Betrayal, he reasoned, belonged to lesser dynasties, not to a lord who had fused biology and destiny into a throne. Bane's rule of two had refined the Sith across 1,000 years. One to embody power, the other to crave it, until betrayal forged a sharper edge. To generations of Sith, this was sacred rhythm. But Plagueis considered himself the last verse in that song. Here's the key. He thought the cycle wasn't eternal, just a furnace meant to craft a final, flawless blade. And he, in his mind, was that blade. To kill him would not refine the Sith, it would regress them. Why temper steel once more if the steel had already reached perfection? He recast himself as the culmination, not another link in the chain. Thus he convinced himself the rule was not law but prologue, destined to end in him. His certainty was so complete that he mistook the doctrine of betrayal for a tool already retired. War is loud, decay is quiet. Plagueis chose the quiet. His grand plan was not to announce the Sith with crimson banners, but to let the Republic rot into empire under its own weight. He moved credits, not legions, whispers, not sabers, senators, guildmasters, and financiers. These were his soldiers. Basically, he was building an empire from within, growing it from the Republic's own roots until conquest would be unnecessary. Yet such a plan required a mask, a public figure who could smile for cameras while the hidden hand clenched in private. He did not desire an apprentice in the old Sith sense. He wanted a proxy, an instrument, a voice that could move in the daylight. In his mind, the rule of two became an inconvenience, a tradition too small for his vision. He did not want a rival in his house. He wanted a voice for his will. The rule of two required a successor, but Plagueis envisioned a new order, one that left room for only himself. Apprentices were daggers, always pointed upward. He longed for something blunter, an instrument without edge, a mask that could walk in the Senate's halls while he remained the hidden hand. Think of it as the public interface to his back-end power. In his arrogance, he reasoned that true mastery silenced the cycle. A master who could bend biology, suspend death, and choke destiny itself into obedience was too necessary to replace. He rationalized that if he chose carefully enough, he would never risk betrayal. Thus he began the reluctant search, not for a student, but for a vessel, an emissary who could operate in daylight while his own shadow stretched eternal. On Naboo, the dark side exhaled a singular chill, a youth whose ambition gleamed like polished cruelty. Palpatine radiated hunger, but more than hunger, a political instinct sharper than any vibroblade. Here's the key. He could hide in the Force so completely that even Plagueis himself could not sense him. To the Master, this was not a boy but an omen. Chance dissolved in that moment. Destiny had spoken. Invisibility was the one trait his grand design demanded, an executor born unseen, a serpent gliding openly through fields of prey. Palpatine was too perfect, too exact to be accident. To ignore him would be to defy the will of the dark side itself. Thus, the apprentice he never intended to take arrived at his door, the anomaly that became his answer. The mask he could not refuse. Plagueis opened doors no mortal could touch, introductions to bankers, entanglements with guildmasters, and discreet corridors within the Senate's marble labyrinth. Palpatine stepped through each one with flawless poise, learning to smile for a crowd while tightening invisible nooses around their necks. Basically, Plagueis built his runway to power. With each stride, dependence grew on both sides. The student clung to his master's knowledge of the dark side, and the master leaned upon the student's growing prominence in daylight. Interdependence felt like security, a balance that promised permanence. But in truth, it was a blindfold stitched from victories, a web in which the spider could not tell that it had entangled itself. What Plagueis saw as harmony was, in reality, the quiet preparation of a blade. Palpatine rose faster than any apprentice before him, a serpent crowned by daylight, a whisper turned into law, a senator and manipulator whose smile masked storms. To the world he was indispensable. To Plagueis, indispensable meant safe. Think of it this way, he mistook irreplaceable for loyal. He confused necessity with devotion, as though building the Republic's future on his apprentice's back guaranteed fidelity. In that dangerous misreading, he reclassified the rule itself. What had always been an anvil for murder became, in his mind, a charter for partnership. The ancient cycle of violence could now be retired, replaced by co-rule, eternal and unbroken. From that revision, the seed of impossible to betray sprouted in his heart. And from that seed, his doom began to grow. Over vats and monitors, Plagueis stretched life like hammered gold, leaf thin, gleaming, obedient to his touch. He had watched the midichlorians bow, had commanded breath to linger when nature would have withdrawn it, had tugged the thread of conception itself. Here's the key. He thought death had become a negotiable contract. With such dominion, violence no longer frightened him. A blade at his throat meant nothing if blood could be restored, if organs could be persuaded to heal. The apprentice's wrath would be reduced to a tantrum, painful, yes, but reversible. And so vigilance, his final true ally, was lulled to sleep at his side. In his mind, immortality was already won. The rule of two had been rewritten, the final correction achieved. He mistook laboratory silence for invulnerability. The master kept one lock unpicked, the complete grammar of midichlorians. He taught Palpatine enough to make him formidable, but not enough to make him sovereign. Basically, he believed Palpatine still needed him to finish the last lesson. That final page of the book, How to Command Life and Death, absolutely he withheld, believing it bound his apprentice tighter than chains of Beskar. Gratitude and dependency, he imagined, would hold Sidious forever. Yet ambition does not study in order to graduate, it studies to escape. Each withheld secret did not tether the apprentice, it sharpened the hunger. In believing that knowledge was a leash, Plagueis forgot the truth of Sith appetites. What is concealed does not bind, it provokes. Palpatine, ever climbing, saw in Plagueis not a father of power, but its ceiling. Think of it this way, to an absolute climber, any roof becomes an insult. Where Plagueis peered down from the heights of eternity, seeing a partner, Palpatine peered up and saw only an obstacle, a master presuming to share what must be singular. To one, the mirror reflected permanence. To the other, it reflected confinement. And in that dissonance, the oldest truth of the Sith whispered again, there cannot be two. Between those gazes, the master's serene assumption of loyalty, the apprentice's simmering contempt, the door to betrayal stood wide open, unguarded by anything except the master's certainty. Coruscant glittered like a chalice, as the Senate crowned a hidden Sith with a public laurel. Palpatine, as Chancellor, stood radiant in the eyes of the galaxy. To Plagueis, it seemed the culmination of Bane's thousand-year vision. Here's the key. He believed the galaxy itself had finally stepped into his palm. He drank triumph as prophecy fulfilled, savoring the moment he could at last envision stepping into daylight without fear. He spoke of co-rule, of permanence, of the cycle's final page, an eternal partnership where master and apprentice would reign as equals. The city hummed in agreement, mistaking shadow for order, while the dark side, amused, said nothing. Plagueis toasted his apprentice as partner. Sidious lifted his glass and silently resolved he would never share. To Bane's furnace, partnership was impurity, strength was proved only by severance. Sith tradition was fire and blade, not concord. Basically, two thrones offend the rule even when gilded in victory. Yet Plagueis mistook completion for exemption. He told himself that by having refined the apprentice into the perfect instrument, he had also refined the rule itself. What was once a cycle of betrayal could now be a covenant of eternity. He spoke of co-rule as though it were evolution, not blasphemy. But in the theology of the Sith, equality is a wound, and wounds must be cauterized. By proposing permanence with his apprentice, Plagueis turned the creed against himself. In this theological pride, in this heresy against the blood logic of betrayal, he signed his own death warrant, blind to the scripture that demanded it. Penthouse glass held the city like a captive starfield, and vintage wine held the master like flattery. The republic below glimmered in celebration, but in that private chamber, Plagueis envisioned coronation, himself and his apprentice stepping openly into the light as eternal partners. Think of it as the quiet between thunderheads, the false calm before storms converge. He spoke with fervor, promising a future where the mask would be discarded, where the hidden hand would be honored alongside the Chancellor's smile. Each word meant as affirmation. Instead, polished the mirror of Palpatine's contempt until it gleamed blindingly. Sidious listened, nodding, but inside he recoiled at the notion of servitude eternal. The Master's mask breathed in measured rhythm, its hiss a metronome against which decision crystallized. Beneath the toast surface, betrayal took shape like lightning inside a cloud. Wine softened the edges, and confidence erased the rest. Here's the key. Vigilance died before the body did. Plagueis reclined into engineered repose, assured of his apprentice's indispensability and his own eternal dominion. He mistook comfort for security, forgetting that ambition waits not for weakness, but for opportunity. Sidious rose, not in panic, but with the arithmetic certainty the rule had always demanded. Betrayal was not rebellion, it was formula. A hand extended, invisible yet absolute, crushing the device that sustained his master's fragile flesh. Then came the storm, arcs of lightning, each bolt a verse of the Sith's oldest hymn. The master convulsed as the city outside roared in ignorant joy. Certainty, the jewel Plagueis had polished for decades, shattered soundlessly in that penthouse, unseen by all but the apprentice who had finally decided to collect his inheritance. In their final lock, Plagueis' gaze was calm, as if the grave were merely a corridor to another laboratory. Basically, he looked like a man who thought he'd already won. Lightning scorched his body. The mask lay shattered, and yet he stared with the chilling serenity of one who believed himself eternal. That calm became Palpatine's private haunting, the silent image of a teacher who insisted that death no longer had jurisdiction. But the body betrayed him in the end, obeying the oldest verdict the galaxy has ever known. Breath failed, cells surrendered, and arrogance collapsed into silence. The void does not arbitrate, it consumes. Plagueis' eyes, still serene, carried certainty even as they dimmed, leaving Sidious with triumph mingled with unease. The master had died, believing himself unkillable, and that illusion, more than the body itself, would linger like a specter in his apprentice's memory. Ignorance did not blind him, philosophy did. Plagueis trusted a system he believed he had already outgrown. Think of it this way. He assumed the rule of two was a ladder, and he had reached the top rung beyond its reach. He reasoned that immortality negated motive, that dependency erased desire, that partnership could rewrite doctrine. In doing so, he let the very guards of his empire, doubt, vigilance, suspicion, fall asleep. Each assumption was a sentry dismissed from its post. The more he cloaked his arrogance in the robes of wisdom, the less he felt the need to prepare for treachery. And by the time that certainty had finished dressing itself as philosophy, betrayal had already entered the room, unannounced and unopposed, wearing the face of his chosen heir. Plagueis named Palpatine Destiny's answer, the chosen vessel for his design, the dark side's perfect gift. Here's the key. The gift was actually the knife. The youth from Naboo answered the plan's need for secrecy too perfectly to be random. Therefore, Plagueis believed he was providential. Yet he forgot the dark side's cruelty, its habit of wrapping executioners in the same ribbon as saviors. By venerating Palpatine as a sign from the Force, he transformed him into a sacred trust, not a rival. That misreading became lethal. The serpent he thought was delivered to help him weave the Republic into Empire had been sent instead to cut the thread. To call his apprentice destiny was not foresight. It was a fatal error of faith. He trusted in method. Centuries of refinement, the discipline of patience, the elegance of quiet conquest. Basically, he believed doing everything right made him untouchable. In his mind, flawless execution was armor, and armor could not be pierced. But the rule venerates outcome, not orthodoxy. A blade cares nothing for the elegance of your notes if it reaches the heart. The history of the Sith had proven again and again that perfection is no vaccine against betrayal. Yet Plagueis, wrapped in the belief that patience and mastery had carried him beyond danger, mistook form for invulnerability. He built walls of logic, doctrine, and achievement, and in the end, those walls did not stop lightning. They only made the chamber echo when they fell. By elevating his apprentice into daylight, Plagueis surrendered the night. Think of it this way. The plan no longer needed its architect once the facade could hold itself. As Chancellor, Palpatine could conjure crises, steer votes, and mask malice without his master's guidance. The apprentice had outgrown the gardener who planted him. To Plagueis, this was proof of success. To Sidious, it was proof of redundancy. The Empire to be did not require two pairs of hands to shape it any longer. The master had optimized himself out of his own design. In granting his apprentice supreme visibility, Plagueis unknowingly signed away his own indispensability. He mistook elevation for alliance, when in fact it was the scaffold upon which his own obsolescence would hang. He told himself conquest remained incomplete. The Jedi still drew breath. The Republic still stood. The galaxy had not yet fallen fully to Sith dominion. Here's the key. Unfinished to him meant safe. Plagueis believed that so long as the great work remained, ambition would wait, held in check by the logic of completion. He assumed Sidious would never act while milestones were unmet, while enemies still lived. Yet the apprentice's doctrine was far simpler than the master's strategy. Remove the ceiling now, finish the story later. Hunger does not wait for neat conclusions. It consumes at once, then digests over time. By mistaking continuity for security, Plagueis blindfolded himself against urgency. His own sense of patience, once a virtue, became the rope with which he bound himself to the chair. The master believed the grammar of life itself was the ransom note that would forever buy his safety. He thought that by hoarding the last verse of the midichlorian symphony, he held Sidious on a leash finer than any chain. Basically, he believed he had the one tool his apprentice could not live without. But Palpatine was not hunting for cures, he was hunting for crowns. What use is the language of life to a man who craves an empire that answers to his name? The leverage was mispriced. Instead of tethering Sidious, it provoked emancipation. Every withheld secret became not a bond of gratitude but a thorn of contempt. Knowledge, Plagueis thought, was a lock on the cage. In truth, it was a hammer in the apprentice's hand. Plagueis recited the rule as though it were eternal law, yet in his own mind he placed himself outside its syntax. Think of it like reading a law you do not believe applies to you. He believed betrayal to be the punctuation of lesser dynasties, the weak, the impatient, the unimaginative. His age, perfected by biology and philosophy, would rise beyond such crude mechanics. He crowned himself the culmination of Bane's legacy, and in doing so, rewrote the text of Sith survival to exclude himself. But what he composed was not scripture, it was hubris masquerading as doctrine. In assuming himself the exception, he wrote a theology that could not save him. For the dark side reads no footnotes, it recognizes only one truth. That every apprentice must one day strike. Tenebris believed that mathematics could preserve a master, that probabilities could account for ambition. They did not. Here's the key. Precedent already testified against Plagueis, but he ignored the ledger. Every master before him had trusted a formula, Bane with his rules, Tenebris with his equations, and every one of them had died, betrayed. Yet Plagueis penciled himself as the exception, choosing arithmetic where history demanded humility. He looked at his own brilliance as proof that the chain of blood would finally end. But the shadow of his teacher still clung to him. a master who trusted numbers only to fall beneath inevitability. Plagueis should have seen it as warning. Instead, he read it as distance, imagining himself immune. And so Tenebris's fate became prophecy, one that Plagueis would repeat more perfectly than his master ever had. He imagined two black suns sharing one sky, their gravity fused, their light joined in eternal balance. Basically, he reinvented the Sith as partners. Plagueis convinced himself that the ancient rivalry between master and apprentice could be replaced with harmony, that the rule of two had been perfected to its final stage. He spoke of eternity not as solitude, but as duet. He, the hidden alchemist of life, and Palpatine, the Chancellor in daylight, bound as co-sovereigns. Yet dual sovereignty is a contradiction in a creed that worships singular will. In proposing co-rule, he did not transcend the rule, he profaned it. For the dark side does not honor balance, it honors dominion. The cosmos that answers to its call recognizes only one center at a time. And in that imagined partnership, he authored his own heresy, offering Palpatine not equality but the provocation to strike. Palpatine's flawless concealment in the Force convinced Plagueis that stealth and obedience walked hand in hand. Think of it this way: if the Jedi can't see him, maybe his ambition can't see you. To Plagueis, this invisibility meant safety, the perfect safeguard for the grand plan. But in truth, invisibility served only the apprentice. A hidden flame grows strongest in darkness. The same gift that fooled Jedi Masters also fooled the one who should have known better. For every moment Palpatine remained unseen, his hunger expanded, unchallenged and unmeasured. Cloaked desire grows healthiest. To Plagueis, he was destiny's mask. To Palpatine, he was destiny itself. And while the galaxy remained blind to the serpent sharpened his fangs against the very hand that trusted him. The master believed the apprentice depended on his secrets. The apprentice believed the master depended on his office. Here's the key. Both were correct, but only one felt insulted by it. Plagueis hoarded the grammar of life, certain that Palpatine would never strike while there was still more to learn. But Sidious had already decided he did not need those lessons. What he needed was freedom from the hand always holding his leash. He converted necessity into contempt, reshaping dependence into insult. To him, if he was indispensable to the grand plan, then his master's continued existence was not partnership, but parasitism. The cure for parasites is removal. Where Plagueis saw chains that guaranteed loyalty, Palpatine saw shackles that guaranteed resentment. In that reversal, the apprentice prepared the blade. Coruscant's revels masked a funeral that had not yet occurred. Basically, the city cheered while the rule sharpened its knife. The glass canyons glowed with celebration at Sidious's rise to Chancellor, the Republic itself bowing to Sith design without knowing it. In the penthouse above, Plagueis mistook the music of triumph for the song of permanence. He drank deeply, believing history had ended in his favor. But triumph blinds as surely as rage. The cheers below were not hymns to his survival. They were drums masking the approach of inevitability. While the city applauded, power condensed into a single chamber, a single decision, a single betrayal waiting to strike. Plagueis thought the galaxy had entered his palm. In truth, he had already been weighed, already found redundant by the apprentice, who smiled beside him. Lightning crowned a tradition older than the Senate itself. Sidious did not improvise. He simply honored the creed that had sharpened the Sith for 1,000 years. Think of it as the rite of succession, unwritten, inevitable. Every apprentice rises by ending a sentence written in a master's blood. Sidious pronounced that period with clinical economy, his hand closing on the life mask, his power pouring through veins once thought inviolable. Plagueis, who had written treatises on eternity, read his own ending as though it were a typo, a mistake, soon to be corrected. Yet the rule of two was no draft, it was canon. And in that canon, his apprentice had written the only proper punctuation, a final, unanswerable strike. The law he believed himself beyond had simply reclaimed him, marking him not as an exception, but as its most perfect fulfillment. Silence reclaimed the chamber. The city outside still sang. Here's the key. The galaxy rarely notices when theology changes hands. Crowds toasted their chancellor. Fireworks bled light into the night sky, but in one room the lineage of power shifted irrevocably. Sidious looked on the stillness, and in it he saw truth. The dark side rewards sovereignty, not seniority. The plan did not die with its architect. It continued, sleeker, freed from the burden of partnership. Plagueis had believed the galaxy was stepping into his palm. Instead, he became the dust shaken off the hand. What mattered was not who designed the ladder, but who stood on its top rung. For the first time, Sidious looked into a future unshadowed by another will, and he understood himself as the sole inheritor of a creed that had finally delivered on its promise. Plagueis' fall did not rise from ignorance, but from elevation. One can tumble from a pedestal as easily as from a cliff. Basically, he overlearned success. Years of flawless patience and mastery had convinced him that method itself was protection, that doing everything right created a shield against the oldest truth. His insight calcified into idolatry. His discipline became myth. He worshipped his own design more than the living will of the dark side. And in that worship, he forgot the primal engine that animates all Sith ambition, to be the only will that remains. The Apprentice, ever hungrier, remembered what the Master had chosen to forget. Where Plagueis saw harmony, Sidious saw hierarchy. Where Plagueis envisioned co-rule, Sidious demanded dominion. In that misalignment, arrogance became fatal proof that no strategy, however elegant, can annul the ferocity of hunger. The scientist king discovered too late that cells obey stars, and stars obey will until a stronger will ends the argument. Think of it this way: biology could not outvote theology. Plagueis' instruments bowed to doctrine, and his doctrine crumbled before the rule he had hoped to retire. He thought midichlorians were leverage. That research had rewritten the script, but the rule sat up in the dark and took his pulse by force. Lightning turned theory into ash. His laboratory immortality proved not a shield, but a research note, fragile as paper under fire. In death, he revealed the limit of his empire. No microscope, no experiment, no theorem could prevent the inevitable blade of succession. The body of the biologist sagged into silence, while the apprentice stood crowned not by science, but by the ancient liturgy of betrayal. Once daylight wore the serpent's smile, the hidden hand became redundant. Sidious no longer needed Plagueis as architect. The facade had become the fortress itself. Here's the key. When the facade becomes the fortress, architects become walls, and walls are useful only until they block the view of the throne. Palpatine understood this with pitiless clarity. He had inherited every connection, every secret pathway into power, and now he ruled openly as Chancellor. The public man devoured the private plan. What had once been Plagueis' invisible masterpiece was now Palpatine's stage, applauded as destiny fulfilled. The galaxy celebrated efficiency and order, never realizing the true cost. In that triumph, the architect's shadow ceased to matter. Sidious tore down the scaffolding, leaving only himself illuminated, the sole sovereign of a vision no longer shared. Tenebris trusted math, Bane trusted rules, Plagueis trusted immortality. Basically, each trusted an exception to the same truth. Every one of them died, betrayed. The pattern was not a bedtime story told to frighten apprentices. It was the spinal cord of Sith survival. One spine, one skull. When two appear, the body corrects itself. Plagueis convinced himself that his brilliance placed him outside this law. He believed the cycle of betrayal was a furnace now cooled, its final work already done in him. Yet the pattern remained merciless. Every exception is simply a more elegant form of the same mistake. Plagueis' conviction of immortality was no shield, only a more spectacular arrogance waiting to be punished. In the end, the rule of two remained undefeated, correcting him as it had corrected every master before. Because every vector seemed to converge: political indispensability, biological supremacy, and doctrinal revision. Think of it this way: 3 locks on a door he forgot to close. Plagueis mistook convergence for consecration, believing the dark side itself had blessed him with permanence. The galaxy bent to his design. His apprentice sat crowned as chancellor. His research promised life without end. What more proof could destiny provide? But the dark side does not bless. It bargains, and then it collects. On the night of collection, all 3 locks sprang at once. Politics, biology, and doctrine failed together. The Chancellor no longer required him. Death struck faster than he could heal, and the rule of two reasserted itself in lightning. The impossible belief shattered, replaced by the truth that no convergence can nullify hunger. Watching certainty die taught Sidious the only permanent lesson the Sith ever accept. Here's the key. Permanence is a lie. Advantage is real. He saw the calm in Plagueis' eyes as the lightning consumed him, and he filed it away as a relic, a warning, not a truth. For Sidious, the image of a master who believed himself eternal became the final joke of the rule. What mattered was not eternity, but opportunity. From that moment, he vowed that his own empire would rise on doctrine, without footnotes, a creed stripped of illusions about loyalty or co-rule. There would be no equals, no exceptions, no architects left standing beside him. The revelation was brutal in its clarity. The dark side rewards only sovereignty, and sovereignty cannot be shared. What perished in that room fertilized a harsher garden. Darth Sidious inherited every tool of his master: deception, manipulation, the art of financial and political decay, but he burned the fantasy of partnership to ash. Basically, the plan lived, the planner didn't. The grand design no longer required two hands. Sidious kept the instruments but stripped them of sentiment, wielding them as a single sovereign star. In the vacuum left by Plagueis' death, ambition condensed into something absolute, something unshareable. The Senate, blind and jubilant, mistook his heat for dawn. They saw reform and leadership. In truth, they beheld the flowering of empire. Plagueis' arrogance had planted the seed, but Sidious harvested it without hesitation. Thus the Sith vision carried forward, not in harmony, but in domination. Plagueis' greatest promise, mastery over life itself, proved his greatest mirage. He believed knowledge of the midichlorians could grant him eternal leverage, that no apprentice would strike while one last secret remained. Think of it as chasing the horizon, always instructive, never protective. For knowledge can enthrone, but it cannot enthrall forever. Sidious sought a crown, not a curriculum. Every lesson shortened the distance to his master's end, for with each page taught, contempt grew stronger than gratitude. In the end, the science that Plagueis trusted became the very weakness that betrayed him. He was not murdered despite his knowledge, he was murdered because of it. To Palpatine, life's mysteries were trifles compared to the immediacy of rule. The mirage shimmered bright until lightning revealed it for what it was: empty air. He thought the rule had finished its work in him. In truth, it had barely begun. Plagueis mistook his own elevation as conclusion, believing he had crowned the cycle's final victor. Here's the key: the rule does not retire, it repeats. Each turn pares away sentiment, theory, and genius, leaving only the naked will to power. Plagueis believed himself the period at the end of the Sith sentence. The rule insisted he was only a clause. His death proved the doctrine was stronger than any philosophy or experiment, stronger even than the man who believed himself eternal. In thinking himself the culmination, he made himself the most refined victim yet, completing the cycle with tragic perfection. The irony was cruel but absolute. The master who claimed to have ended betrayal instead embodied it more completely than any before him. The saga remembers him as Plagueis the Wise, architect of silence, biologist of fate, the final optimist of the Sith. Basically, his certainty taught Sidious to doubt everything except power. His name survives not in the empire he dreamed of ruling, but in the cautionary tale he provided. For the dark side does not mark betrayal as failure, it consecrates it as right. To believe betrayal impossible is to kneel blindfolded before its altar. Plagueis' greatest legacy, then, was not his science, nor his plan, nor even his arrogance. It was the lesson his apprentice carried forward, that in the liturgy of the Sith, betrayal is not breach, but benediction. Not accident, but inevitability. Impossible was simply the word spoken by those about to be replaced. And with that, Darth Sidious rose, carrying the certainty of his master as a ghost chained forever to his triumph.